There are well over 100 different movement techniques in Apex Legends, each one with their own difficulty to execute and their own level of viability. And it's still really hard to know which ones you should actually care about. Because with all these options, how do you know which techniques you should spend time learning and which techs that actually are worth using in-game? Well, you don't need to wonder anymore, as today we'll be going over every single movement technique, and not only that, we'll also rate them based on how useful they actually are, so you know which techniques you should put effort into learning and when to use them. I'll be rating every movement technique primarily based on their viability in everyday games, across all or specific situations, but also weighing in a few factors such as difficulty to execute, difficulty to learn, and the risk versus reward. And as usual, if you disagree with my takes, which I know many will be doing, feel free to tell me as such in the comments. You're free to skip ahead to any tier that you want to in the video, but it might be difficult to follow along towards the end if you haven't been picking up the essentials in the earlier tiers. I'm of course extending my thanks to Moki Sniper, who posted his complete list of all current movement techniques in his Apex Rollout subreddit, because, without this list, this video would take a lot longer to put together. It even has several techniques that I've never heard of, and I had to turn myself into a movement technique encyclopedia just to understand these techniques and what I believe to properly rank them in separate tiers. I'll of course link his complete list in the comments. Starting off with the F tier, we'll have a mix of fundamental movement techniques that make the base of the game, combined with some techniques that I believe are just unnecessarily complicated with little to no reward. On their own, these fundamental techniques may not be that important, but they make the basics for more useful techniques down the line, and I definitely consider them important to mention just for later on. So obviously we have to add the ridiculously simple technique, if you can even call it that, of holstering. Holstering your weapon makes you run faster, get more momentum from jumps, and more. Crouching is another very simple technique that slows you down and makes you a smaller target, and it's a huge piece of several pivotal movement techniques later on in the video. It can also be spammed mid-fight to make yourself a bit harder to hit, but crouch spamming does lead to free headshots for the enemy if they're aiming for center of mass, and they tend to slow you down, making yourself more easy to hit. The act of strafing on its own isn't that spectacular, but much like crouching, can be used to dodge bullets in the middle of a fight. You can also combine the two to make yourself even harder to hit. Sliding combines sprinting and crouching and allows you to build a little bit of momentum, make yourself harder to hit, and just like with crouch, is a key to some of the best movement techniques in the game. Jump fatigue on its own is completely useless. Being in a jump fatigue state means that your character only does sort of a half jump whenever you try jumping. This one in particular will make more sense later, so trust me. Skydiving and skydiving cancel is something tiny that I felt should be worth mentioning, because obviously there's going to be techniques to get from the dropship to the drop spot that you want, and you can actually strafe mid-skydive and hit a wall to cut the skydive short and plummet to your target destination. Moving on with the E tier, we have techniques that are either building blocks into other movement techniques, or some less useful techniques that are worth knowing about, but are very rarely, if ever, worth using. Coyote time refers to the small window after dropping off a ledge where you are able to add a jump input despite not actually touching the ground, referring to Coyote from the Roadrunner cartoon. Lurching is a movement technique or mechanic that only works on mouse and keyboard to give you mid-air movement and allow you to more easily hit wall jumps and other movement techniques. False stun mantle cancel is, as described, when dropping off a large height, you grab onto a ledge and initiate a mantle to then cancel it to stop yourself from getting false stun. However, compared to its options, which we will cover later in the video, it is the worst out of all those options, as you still get locked into a mantle animation rather than the false stun itself, so, pick your poison. Straight up jump pad allows you to step onto Octane's jump pad and bouncing straight up repeatedly. And then moving on, we have a really fun movement technique, if you even want to call it that, but due to the nature of it, it generally requires quite a bit of a setup. That being momentum carry. Objects that you can interact with in the Apex world, such as doors, bins, gondolas, and trident, and more, can all store and carry already existing momentum. And if you come at one of these objects or combine it with other movement techniques, you will get an insanely huge speed boost compared to if you would just do them off a static object. For example, super gliding or snuggle jumping off a gondola on World's Edge. Mag Leap uses something called window magnetism and allows you to randomly make an incredibly high jump at these specific types of ziplines that are only available in some parts of the map. It looks cool, but requires certain binds in order to pull off, and I honestly still don't see the benefit. So let's move on to the D tier. These are generally movement techniques that can give you a small benefit, but are oftentimes too niche, needing the ideal conditions with a high risk for usually very little reward. The first one being zip jumping and zip crouching, which is just the act of how you get off a zipline. Jumping off of a zipline will give you a bit of an upward momentum, whereas crouching will send you downwards. This is especially useful when zipline dancing around something like the streamer or the construction buildings. Zipline air dancing is also not necessarily too much of a benefit and has actually been gimped since a while back, but it is the act of dropping off a zipline at 600 velocity and then reattaching yourself either in the same direction or after turning 180 degrees. The 600 velocity mark being the most ideal point where you want to get off the zipline. Continuing with the spirit of ziplines, especially Pathfinder placed ones, we have the hyper jump. The hyper jump is sort of like a super jump, at least at the very start, but is later followed by another jump input at the perfectly right timing to hit another super jump. It's very hard to pull off, and you can't use scroll wheel jumping to help you hit this delicate timing either, adding to its inconsistency and why I would keep it in the D tier. Crouch climb or crouch jump is an incredibly old technique that stems from previous Source Engine games without climbing, where the user will attempt to jump onto a box or any other object, and then hitting crouch mid-air, which pulls their legs up and allows them to get high enough. Ghost interacting is interacting with a zipline that you shouldn't be able to, but being at a certain range from that zipline and looking either up or down. This is pretty useless on its own short of throwing an enemy off, but will prove to be very useful as we progress with the video. Fall stun corner cancel refers to a very difficult to pull off movement technique that allows you to drop from a great height and not only not take any fall stun, but also keep the momentum and convert it into forward momentum. This is done by landing right next to the corner of a wall or some type of weirdly angled rock. Damage boosting yourself through grenades or other means such as certain abilities gives you some extra momentum at the cost of your own health. And it's really niche because why would you ever give up your most vital resource to fight someone else, other than looking really cool when doing it? Anyways, let's take a look at some other grapple techniques such as the super grapple. The super grapple is a faster version of a normal grapple which requires you to aim your grapple at the very edge of an object, where the crosshair indicator that normally would turn blue when you aim at something in range stays orange. By following this with a slightly different jump timing, Pathfinder can fly a lot farther and a lot faster than the ordinary slingshot grapple, which is the standard grapple technique where a Pathfinder will hit a grapple on an object, look 90 degrees away from it, and as they are being reeled in, slowly turning their aim to keep the target at 90 degrees away, while adding movement inputs as they turn towards the target, eventually breaking the 90-degree angle as they pass through the target and go flying. Grapple momentum carry probably refers to how you can use a grapple while already in movement to carry the same momentum forward. Jump pad ceiling surfing, or surfing in general, has been nerfed but can still be pulled off to a certain degree. If you place a jump pad in an area with a low enough ceiling, your character will sort of surf along the ceiling instead of following the typical jump pad arc. And if you still have upwards momentum as you get out from under the ceiling, you will still get pushed upwards. Jump pad melee plus direction is a very niche jump pad technique where you can punch towards a jump pad enough to where the lead up places you on top of it, and then follow it up with a direction input in any direction. This will make you bounce a specific direction that your input leads. Horizon walkthrough lift is abusing Horizon's weird interaction with a gravity lift that has just been placed. It is a little bit inconsistent and doesn't serve much of a use except when you escape an enemy by throwing your lift in front of a doorway and running through it before it would lift you. The Revenant Grenade Climb uses grenade boosting, where you throw a grenade at your feet before starting a climb, which as it explodes gives you an incredible amount of momentum to climb at an insanely high speed. Maggie's Wrecking Ball Explosion Boost is at most something you use to throw off your opponents and maybe even look cool while doing so. It involves either throwing your ball at a nearby enemy or timing it perfectly when running so it blows up behind you, giving you that tiny boost in one direction. This will come at the cost of stunning you, so other than getting one style shot in, it really isn't worth it. And that was it for the D tier, so let's take a look at some C tier movement techniques. These are generally more useful than the ones in the D tier, and in some cases a lot more easy to pull off. Another jump pad technique other than the one that we mentioned is sliding through and tap strafing, where you abuse the short activation window on the jump pad when placing it to slide straight through it, and then tap strafe 180 degrees to instantly change your direction, but still have another double jump at hand. I had to put this here, I haven't mentioned tap strafing yet, we'll get to it, okay? We'll get to it. The Revenant Corner Wall Run refers to Revenant slide climbing along walls and then tap strafing around the corner whenever he gets around the corner to keep moving. The sideways climb that I mentioned earlier is also a C tier technique, as it isn't limited to Revenant specifically and has some uses, but in most cases is just a niche cool technique. A Trimp is a niche but cool movement technique or goofy engine interaction where if you come towards an upwards angle with some horizontal momentum, you may slide against it and have that momentum convert into upwards momentum as well. A grapple hop is a pretty useful Pathfinder grapple technique where you grapple the ground, jump, and then cancel it to immediately do a fast high jump. This can be used to take high ground, rotate, or just to throw off enemies. The Rampart Sheila double climb is a super niche use technique where you can initiate a climb, jump into a placed Sheila, and then jump out again to get a slightly higher climb animation. Watson Insta Holster allows you to instantly holster your weapon without the holster down animation by using your tactical and then pulling up a weapon, cutting the gun switch animation time in half. Next up are a few magnetism techniques that are a little bit more useful than the one I mentioned previously. First off, we have Mag Tap Jump, which allows you to jump a lot higher than any super or hyper jump, practically straight up in zipline buildings, sometimes as far as going from the bottom all the way to the top. Another niche but pretty useful technique, at least for confusing your enemies, is the magnetism heal in Shaft, using something called a mag bounce. You can pull off a mag bounce by jumping towards the edge of an exit in a zipline shaft, and then timing a jump input and side strafe at the right time. Since you don't need to climb, this can be combined with any healing items. The zip rail super jump at the end allows you to jump a bit higher from a zip rail and keep some momentum. Moving on, we have bunny hop, or something that's more commonly known as b-hop, where you can spam jump inputs to keep your momentum going forward. This is an old source quirk and movement technique which lets you travel a lot farther than instantly stopping once you hit the ground. A slide hop, not to be confused with a b-hop or slide jump, is the same as a b-hop, but you hold crouch, which in turn makes you smaller and more difficult to hit, at the expense of losing some momentum. Slide hops can also be combined with healing to retain a little bit more momentum than with a normal b-hop. A momentum shift is an old, less useful version of the movement technique that we'll mention later in the video, which basically allows you to turn 90 degrees midair by jumping, turning around, and then inputting a backwards lurch to turn where you want to go. Octane's stim healing refers to popping his tactical right before finishing a mid kit or phoenix kit, as this will restore him to full health while still giving him the speed boost from his tactical. The stim completely negates slowdowns and can be used to get rid of most types of slowdown effects in the game. Jump out of a climb backwards is self-explanatory, but it's basically just climbing up a wall and then adding a jump input with a backwards input. This will send you off of the wall and can be used to throw your enemies off, as well as allow you to follow it up with a slide or other type of movement. A jump slide is generally referring to jumping and then following it up with a slide as you hit the ground, but can be taken to the next level by incorporating lurching. You can jump in one place and then steer yourself slightly with lurches while midair, and then follow up with a slide to change your slide into any direction that you would like. The Valkyrie Moonboots is a fairly niche technique where you can float after taking a zipline, assuming you've hit your thrusters beforehand. It's not super useful due to being so niche and needing to waste your fuel, but it's definitely really fun to do if you are playing Valkyrie. The Valkyrie Ledge Peak is abusing the fact that Valkyrie is the fastest legend in the game to peak a ledge, and all it takes to use it is using your jetpack onto a ledge and then just shooting. Also, an extra tip while we're at it, grabbing a ledge after flying with your jetpack also cancels the peace sign animation that's gotten me killed so many times. Let's head into the B tier, which has significantly more useful techniques, and when compared to several techniques from earlier in the video, they're usually pretty simple to pull off with very little risk and a pretty good reward. A ledge slide is a quick, easy technique where you simply slide over a ledge. This, due to the way Apex is coded for whatever reason, will give you some random momentum out of nowhere. A slant boost, on the other hand, is sort of the same, but not really, where you get a movement boost after getting off climbing a ledge. This can be used with a slide to give you forward momentum when you should have been slower, and is a pretty useful way to keep yourself moving. This is also a crucial element of, wait, not yet, more on that later. Because there's also the wall jump or wall bounce or wall hop. It goes by many names, where you can run towards a wall, slide jump, and then immediately follow up with another jump to bounce you off of the wall with some additional momentum. And of course, hand in hand with that goes the wall run, where you can run towards a wall, slide jump, and then initiate a wall climb. This is different than a sideways climb because it is a lot faster and can later be followed up with other movement techniques. You can think of a wall run as a prolonged default wall jump without necessarily jumping off at the very end. Wall hopping is combining several source techniques. Long story short, bunny hopping and something called wall strafing to bunny hop at full speed even while healing, but it is a bit rough to get the angle down. It only works on some walls and you're stuck doing it along a wall. Caustic Trap Fall Stun Cancel is pretty self-explanatory, where Caustic can throw a barrel on the ground underneath him as he is midair, and landing on that barrel will stop him from being hit by Fall Stun. In some cases, even give him some forward momentum that can be abused with sliding. Zip Rail Grapple Dismount refers to how you can look straight down and grapple when letting go of a zip rail, which allows you to keep all the momentum coming off of it. The Geyser Stuck Launch is a very specific and, in my opinion, useful technique where you can go to one of the geysers on World's Edge, crawl under one of the many rocks that stick out before stepping onto the geyser. This will launch you in a more horizontal direction without actually sending you all the way up or putting you in a skydive animation. Holding sideways for higher climb is very simple but extremely useful, where you can add a side input at the very end of your climb to give yourself a tiny boost and reach places you wouldn't be able to otherwise. The U-bounce is a wall run or sideways wall climb combined with a quick turn at the very end, which creates momentum. It's called a U-bounce as the user sort of moves in a curve when doing the full movement. The zipline high-speed exit is half of a technique and half something that you can keep in mind when placing ziplines. If a zipline is placed at a 45-degree angle, riding it all the way to the top will launch you in the direction that it points at. And of course, we're going to have to mention 2 gravity cannon techs in the B tier, one being that you can stand in the back of a gravity cannon or strafing backwards when taking it, which will allow you to hit the top part of a gravity cannon as you land, and in some cases allowing you to slide off of it no matter what legend that you are playing. Sort of abusing the corner boosts that we mentioned earlier. You can also stand right under the edge of a gravity cannon to have it launch you backwards in sort of a reverse trimp that we also mentioned earlier. Next up is something we call an elite jump. This movement technique requires very fast and precise timing, but will allow you to immediately jump up a zipline and the other way to almost fly up into the air and then change your direction. It is especially useful on zipline buildings and is one of the steeples for zipline dancing. Air strafing is a fundamental movement technique that is part of many advanced movement techniques, but it's still very useful on its own. By combining turning their view and adding sideways movement inputs, users can slightly turn while midair. The effect is mostly felt when taking a gravity cannon or a jump pad. And of course, let's move into the A-tier movement techniques. You should probably learn most of these in one way, shape, or form, and they're all incredibly useful to your Apex Legends experience. You will also notice how many of these techniques are going to pull from stuff that I've mentioned in previous tiers. Let's start off with the strafes that give you an insane advantage mid-fight. For example, there's Pito strafe, where you octane stem and slide jump, B-hop forward and then alternate left or right inputs, alongside a forward input and a tap strafe, to bounce to the left and to the right and make yourself very difficult to hit. Then there's the Neo strafe, which is a lot more commonly referred to compared to the Pito. The Neo strafe uses the same principles as the Pito strafe, but will instead send you in about 90 degrees per strafe, making you bounce in a circular pattern. And to close off the mid-fight strafes, of course we have the Ras strafe, where you will jump into the air and combine a tap strafe with lurch air strafe movements in a circular pattern to kind of turn you in the air and juke out enemy shots. The difference here being that you don't change the direction on every bounce, but instead the entire movement is in one fluid mid-air motion. The super jump is yet another movement technique that's fundamental in most techniques on this list, but is completely useful on its own. By hitting a interact input on a zipline at the right timing, followed by a jump input, you will fly upwards in a super high jump. The direction of the zipline doesn't necessarily matter, and I also need to mention another version of the super jump, which is called a crouch super jump, where you run and then crouch before initiating a super jump to gain more distance. This is especially useful on Broken Moon, as the crouch super jump horizontal distance scales with the zip rail velocity boost. Then we have the mantle jump, which uses a combination of ghost inputs, super jumps, and ledge boosts to give you a huge amount of upwards momentum when cancelling a mantle, and following up with a super ghost jump at the peak of a zipline. And it is pretty easy to do consistently once you get used to it, and you get a very good reward. Another fundamental but very useful technique is the fall stun climb cancel, which basically means that you can skip the fall stun penalty by falling against something on the way down and climbing on that thing, even briefly so, before you hit the ground. And now, finally, we're going to the S tier movement techniques. Real quick, before that though, I want to extend a quick thank you for watching this far, and I would love if you would choose to become one of the 17% of people watching my videos to actually hit the subscribe button. These techniques are unbelievably useful, to the point where I would consider them a must to learn, and in many cases, a must use. The first one of these being the fatigue wall jump, which has been one of my favorite techniques to use in recent time. Not only is a fatigue wall jump higher than a typical slide wall jump, but you can enter the fatigue state as you're healing or reloading and immediately pull off a fatigue wall jump the moment that you're done, getting yourself out of a sticky situation if you get caught with your pants down. It is incredibly fun to do and can even be chained probably infinitely with back-to-back fatigue wall jumps. Lately, I've actually been starting the fatigue wall jump chain by doing a slide wall jump, which will start the fatigue state once you land, and then start off a fatigue hop once I hit the ground to then chain the wall jumps together. It's really satisfying to do. Next up is the skip jump, which is a technique that allows you to instantly get the movement buff from a slide without having to pull off a slide animation. You can do this by starting a run, swapping your weapons, then crouching and sliding, and then finishing it off with a final jump. This allows you to create velocity and momentum out of nowhere and can be chained with other movement techniques to pull off impressive acrobatics out of nowhere. As I understand it, another version of skip jumping is the fade slide, which starts from a crouching position rather than standing or walking, where the user starts by crouching, followed by a forward input and sprint, and then immediately sliding and jumping. The no mantle wall bounce is the same as an ordinary wall bounce, but without a forward input when you are midair. This allows you to wall bounce off the smaller ledges that you otherwise would latch onto. Next up, despite being such a high-risk technique, it's still so useful that I believe it deserves to be in the S tier, and that will be super gliding. Super gliding uses the ledge boost combined with a jump put at the right time, with a tiny delay between a crouch and a jump input, specifically about 1 to 3 frames of a difference, to send you flying forward at over 500 velocity. If you fail a super glide, you will generally be stuck at a ledge or just slide forward, but the speed boost is enough to break any user's ankles on its own. And despite being so difficult to use, it's possible to learn how to master this and become a lot more consistent over time. Hence it being an S-tier technique. Super glides can be combined with a lot of follow-up techniques such as super glide wall bounce, super glide wall run. It stacks with legend abilities such as Bangalore speed boost, Bloodhound speed boost, Wraith's phase or portal speed, and can be combined with side strafe inputs to go to the side, forward, or even backwards. Despite being one of the hardest techniques to learn, it is beyond a must-learn in the current movement space. Another technique that's incredibly useful but a lot easier to learn with a great payoff is the tap strafe. Tap strafing is a PC-specific movement technique, which I did have to mention earlier in the video due to lower techniques using it. But honestly, it's such a fundamental technique that you can't avoid mentioning it at a certain point. By binding your forward key to a scroll wheel or by using a Steam macro, you can stack lurches, which gives you the benefit of mid-air lurching, but to the max, essentially giving you full air acceleration and control of your mid-air movement. And other than the techniques that I mentioned already, the most commonly known form of tap strafe is generally the simple one where you combine Octane's jump pad's double jump with the tap strafe to turn in any direction that you would like. And of course, we can't have a tier list without the most beneficial technique of them all. Despite being so simple, mastering this technique will give you a massive edge over 99.99% of players in the game. And it's definitely the last one you can think of. This movement technique will let you traverse the map so much faster than other players in the lobby and barely has any risk other than looking a little bit silly if you time something wrong. And that technique is slide jumping. Yeah, just running, sliding, and jumping. Even though it's so simple and is way less flashy than all the techniques in this list, its simplicity, its ease of access, and the power that mastering the slide jump brings has to make it the best movement technique in the game. All the other techniques may look flashy, but this one has the largest in-game benefit of them all. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I might dive more into these techniques in guides in the near future, so let me know if you want any more information in the comments. Thank you so much again, and I will see you all tomorrow.